This is all about my intercooler on my VW T4 Transporter 2.5 TDI, which is actually for a Mitsubishi L200 2.5 TDI pickup truck. I have had this fitted previously. I've had a lot of questions about my intercooler install. So in this video, I am going to tell you all about how I went about fitting an intercooler to an AJT engine, which is the same engine block as the ACV. Now the ACV comes standard with the factory intercooler. The AJT version of that engine does not come with an intercooler, does not come with the same injectors, and does not come with the same engine map. I have had the inlet and outlet ports moved from where they were over there to the underside of the intercooler, because the original routing was around a 180-degree turn over here from underneath to the front of the intercooler, and those nice big silicon hoses were fouling the slam panel, which was about here, and squishing the hoses, and I didn't like that. Now the pipe will run from the turbo at the back across the top of the engine, go through roughly a 90-degree turn into the inlet, and then likewise at the outlet it'll go through a 90-degree turn, then another 90-degree turn into the top of the intake manifold through the EGR, or if you don't have an EGR, through the EGR delete pipe, all of which I will show you in a moment. I want to build myself a new intake manifold setup around my modified Mitsubishi L200 alloy aftermarket intercooler. Now the reason why I bought this was because you cannot buy the ACV intercoolers new anymore. They've been unavailable for many years. What I have to do now is figure out how to set up the new hoses with this configuration. The frustration is mainly caused by the fact that I need to have the little bit of tube for the map sensor. Now ideally it would be great if the map sensor could be part of the EGR tube, because then it would just make this whole setup a little bit more compact, but of course it isn't that way. So what I've done is I have purchased for myself a whole bunch of intake tubes to run from the airbox side to the turbo, from the turbo to the intercooler, from the intercooler to the map sensor tube, and then into the EGR, and all the little bits and pieces in between. On the intake, the EGR tube, that diameter is larger than these, so I need to step up, and then also from the turbo to the EGR I need to step up as well. And then from the airbox or air filter to the turbo I've got to step down. It goes from roughly 70 millimeters, I think it was, 3 inches down to 2 inches, and then just under 2 inches to just over 2 inches, and just over 2 inches back to 2.5 inches or something like that. So I need to mix and match those to eliminate the number of times it goes smaller and bigger and bigger and smaller, just to keep the airflow nice and consistent. So let me show you all of the hoses and bends that I've bought to try and cobble this together. This is the original MAF to turbo tube. Now there is a corrugated tube that fits on this to go through that bend from the MAF to the turbo, which is kind of like that. And I have my oil return line blanked off because I do not feed the oil vapor back into my intake system, because it fills up the intercooler with oil over time, and of course it fills up the air intake with oil soot over time, and it just reduces the performance of the engine for a so-called environmental benefit. I can't see how it's an environmental benefit if it makes the vehicle run worse. Sorry, Greta. You can see just how heavily restricted this tube is. And this is simply because it needs to take this shape, because on the right hand drive you've got the brake booster there. So this is not a nice clean running pipe reducing from the MAF to the turbo. So here we've got a 90-degree 51mm silicone hose. I will also be using these T-bolt clamps almost solely in the whole setup now. So here I've got two little hoses, which are just couplers, 51mm couplers. There's an alloy coupler. Here's another little joiner. This is a straight reducer from 54 to 51mm. That's a straight coupler, which is slightly smaller diameter, and then another one which is a slightly smaller diameter than that. But wait, there's more! There's the EGR tube. This is the map sensor and intake temperature sensor. This is the piece of tube that I have to maintain. It's cut down from the original that was on the AGT intake to accommodate the addition of an intercooler without having to use. But you can see that it would be just brilliant if that was mounted actually into the EGR tube, because that would just reduce this whole setup even more. This is a 90-degree reducer, so 51 to 45mm. 135-degree alloy tube, and this is 51mm. So it will sit like that and then come from the turbo underneath there, and then on this side it will go out of here, I think this direction, where it'll take the 135-degree turn, go into the MAF and then into the EGR tube. That is the turbo outlet over there, and the turbo inlet is lower down there. Yep, just over 50mm, 48. Here is the space that tube needs to fit between the intake manifold and the brake booster, and that's why it's got that weird kink in it. This is the aluminium hose and 90-degree bend that goes into the underside of the intercooler from the turbo. So what I will need here is a 90-degree elbow that goes down to the turbo. This is a reducing elbow. So this will go on top of the turbo, hose clamp into this tube here, hose clamp on here, and then that will go into the bottom of the intercooler. Now we need to go from the intercooler to the EGR, and that needs to go through this connector here. These two need to be connected to one another. Okay, so place that on the whole way. This will go. Come on, baby. There we go. Now this can either face up, but probably will be like that, because the intercooler will be over here, and this is where the map sensor and the air intake temperature sensor will be. This ideally needs to be as close as possible to the intake, because the ECU will use this reading to gauge how to fuel the vehicle along with the readings from the MAF. This is post turbo and post intercooler, so ideally I would like this sensor mounted right here, or even on the intake manifold itself. Now I need to go from the outlet of the intercooler, so this will then be something like that, the 45mm to 51 reducer, because 45mm is the underside of the intercooler. The likelihood is that I will need to trim this down, similar to that there where I had to trim it down, and then that will fit on there, we're looking at something like that. So these little straight couplers will give me the flexibility to move these hoses in and out. Likewise over here, move it in and out, and if I need to, I can always trim these. Right up here is the coolant expansion tank and a bunch of hoses and some wires. So this needs to route itself amongst all of that, and of course I've got my air conditioning pipes in here as well. So hopefully these different bits and pieces are going to be able to give me the layout that I want. This is the turbo to intercooler pipe. I'm going to use normal dishwashing fluid. It's a trick from the old school BMX days when we used to fit our grips to our handlebars. I found that dishwashing liquid was the best stuff. There we go. Okay, so this is just a mock-up, so I'm not putting the hose clamps on just yet. Of course, before I fit those hoses, I need to refit my EGR valve. This is obviously vacuum hose. Just put that to the side for the time being. See, that's the end of the tube, and that's the bottom of the expansion tank. But that's what it looks like so far. Now if I pinch this hose, I can feel that there's probably not quite an inch, not quite 2.5 centimeters of space between this one and this one with this connector, and I can't push these two any closer together because of this vacuum connector here and because of that sensor connector over there. So what I'm going to do is shorten this straight connector over here so I can bring these a little bit closer, and that will also mean that if I can bring it back maybe 15 mil, I'll be able to clear the bottom of this bracket, because it's not actually fouling the bottom of the bottle, it's hitting the bottom of the bracket there. What I did next was then connect the map sensor portion of the piping with the coupler to the alloy 135 degree bend, which I actually substituted for a 180 degree alloy bend later on. I then proceeded to fit the intercooler back to the new hoses to figure out whether or not it still fouled the latch mechanism of the bonnet. So where I was going with my intercooler setup and the routing of the intercooler hoses wasn't working out. The problem that I was having was that this curve in this 180 degree alloy elbow was that it was putting the intercooler too far forward again, and I need to move it back. In fact, it was putting it further forward than it was originally when my inlet and outlet were at the front of the intercooler before I had them moved to the bottom. So I found the solution was to substitute the 180 degree alloy elbow with a silicon version, which I then connected to the existing silicon pipes using alloy straight connectors. This had a much tighter curve and also a bit of flexibility to make it fit with the outlet of the intercooler. Got myself a bundle of more T-clamps. That's a little bit big for there, but it's going to be perfect for here. Once I'd attached the T-clamps to all of the hoses and joiners, I then moved on to reinstalling the intercooler and attaching it to the factory intercooler bracket. With that all nicely secured and bolted up, I could then move to refitting the crossmember and the grille. So on the outlet side of the intercooler, you can see it goes through a 90 degree turn into a little connector, then a 180 degree elbow which runs down underneath the expansion tank like that, and it just misses the hose that's underneath the expansion tank. And then just at the back there you can see the other hose where the map sensor is connected at the back, and then it goes into the top of the intake back there. Pretty neat.